A political party in Nigeria has just issued a formal ultimatum to the country's electoral commission. Not a petition, not a press release calling for dialogue, an ultimatum with a deadline and a specific threat attached to it. The African Democratic Congress, the party that brought together Atiku Abubakar, Peter Obi, Rabiu Kwankwaso, Rotimi Amaechi, and Rauf Aregbesola under one roof for the 2027 election, has given INEC 72 hours to restore its leadership on INEC's official portal or face, in their exact words, the lawful occupation of INEC offices across all 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory. While everyone is talking about whether the ADC coalition can survive the INEC derecognition crisis, nobody is asking the more important question: what does it mean for Nigerian democracy when the country's most significant opposition coalition publicly threatens to physically occupy the offices of the institution that will administer the next general election 9 months before that election is due? Because the answer to that question is not simply about the ADC. It is about the state of every institution that Nigeria's democracy depends on, and it is about what happens when those institutions lose the public trust of the people they are constitutionally required to serve equally. Most channels will give you the headline. We give you the architecture behind it. If you have never been here before, you just found Nigeria's most analytical political channel. Subscribe, because what comes next in this video is the part they hope you never piece together. The ultimatum. What was actually said? On Monday, April 7th, 2026, the youth wing of the African Democratic Congress convened a press conference at the party's national headquarters in Abuja. INEC National Youth Leader Balarabe Rufai addressed journalists flanked by members of the youth wing and a coalition of civil society organizations. The demands were specific and formally stated. First, the immediate restoration of the David Mark-led ADC leadership on INEC's official portal. Second, a public apology from INEC for what the youth wing described as unconstitutional and partisan conduct. Third, the cessation of all INEC actions based on letters, pending motions, or non-binding court processes. Fourth, the immediate resignation or removal of INEC Chairman Professor Joash Amupitan. The ultimatum: 72 hours to comply, or ADC youths and allied civil society groups would initiate nationwide peaceful and lawful civic action across all 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory. While everyone is talking about whether the ADC coalition can survive the INEC derecognition crisis, nobody is asking the more important question: what does it mean for Nigerian democracy when the country's most significant opposition coalition publicly threatens to physically occupy the offices of the institution that will administer the next general election 9 months before that election is due? Because the answer to that question is not simply about the ADC. It is about the state of every institution that Nigeria's democracy depends on, and it is about what happens when those institutions lose the public trust of the people they are constitutionally required to serve equally. ADC Press Conference, April 7, 2026. ADC National Youth Leader Balarabe Rufai issued a 72-hour ultimatum at press conference, ADC National Headquarters, Abuja. 4 specific demands stated. Threat of nationwide INEC office occupation confirmed. Direct appeal to military for neutrality on record. Reported across Daily Post, Premium Times, Punch, Information Nigeria, The Whistler, AIT, Ben Television, Prompt News, April 7, 2026. The background. Why this ultimatum was issued. To understand why a political party issued this ultimatum, you must understand the sequence of events that preceded it.
The ADC held a National Executive Committee meeting on July 29, 2025, which dissolved its existing National Working Committee and produced a new leadership headed by former Senate President David Mark, with former Osun State Governor Rauf Aregbesola as National Secretary. INEC received the outcome, verified the process, and officially uploaded and recognized this leadership on its portal on September 9, 2025. However, Rafiu Bala Gombe, who had been the ADC's only existing national vice chairman, contested the legitimacy of the Mark-led NWC on the grounds that he had never resigned and should have automatically assumed the chairmanship. He filed suit number FHC/ABJ/CS/1819/2025 at the Federal High Court on September 2, 2025, 7 days before INEC uploaded the Mark-led names. The Court of Appeal delivered its ruling in suit number CA/ABJ/145/2026 on March 12, 2026, dismissing David Mark's interlocutory appeal and issuing preservatory orders directing all parties to maintain the status quo ante bellum, the situation as it existed before the suit was filed on September 2. Since the Mark-led NWC names were only uploaded to INEC's portal on September 9, reverting to the pre-September 2 position meant removing those names. INEC acted on this on its March 31 meeting and announced it on April 1, 2026. The timing that the ADC finds impossible to separate from politics, on March 30, 2026, the day before INEC acted, Rabiu Kwankwaso formally completed his defection from the NNPP to the ADC. The opposition coalition that had been assembling across months was, at the moment of Kwankwaso's arrival, the most formidable 2027 opposition formation since the APC's own 2015 merger, and within 48 hours, its administrative platform was frozen. The ADC's youth wing described INEC's action as complicity, partisanship, and institutional sabotage. INEC says it was following a Court of Appeal order. Both statements can be technically accurate. The question Afro News HQ is asking is not which party is right on the legal argument. The question is whether INEC's choice of timing, acting on a March 12 court ruling on March 31, 48 hours after Kwankwaso's defection, reflects strict legal compliance or strategic administrative timing. We will return to what the evidence says. The ADC has announced it will proceed with its congresses and national convention on a schedule that runs from April 7 to April 14, 2026, regardless of INEC's freeze. INEC Chairman Professor Amupitan has publicly warned that any congress or convention conducted without INEC supervision exposes the ADC to the Zamfara precedent, where a court later voided election results produced through primaries that violated court orders. We will return to whether David Mark's defiance is a viable legal strategy or a political gamble that could destroy the coalition's 2027 presidential platform before the primary season even opens.
What INEC can and cannot legally do. Let us state the constitutional framework clearly, because it is being misrepresented by both sides in this dispute. Under Section 225 of the 1999 Constitution and the Electoral Act 2022, INEC is empowered to maintain the register of political parties and to recognize their governance structures, provided those structures conform with the party's own constitution and Nigerian law. When two factions both claim to represent a party's legitimate leadership and both petition INEC, the Commission has administrative authority to make a determination. The limitation that the ADC's lawyers are emphasizing: INEC is not a court. It does not conduct trials. It does not weigh evidence under judicial rules. It reviews documentation and makes an administrative call. That call is subject to challenge in the Federal High Court, but a challenge requires time, correct procedural filings, and a judiciary willing to move with urgency. And in an electoral calendar where the primary window matters, a court challenge launched after INEC recognition may not produce a ruling before the 2027 window closes. The SEC 83 legal bomb. Here is the provision that could change everything about this dispute, and that mainstream Nigerian media has not yet analyzed with sufficient depth. Section 83, subsection 5 of the Electoral Act 2026 states that no court in Nigeria shall entertain jurisdiction over any suit or matter pertaining to internal affairs of a political party. Section 83, subsection 6 prohibits courts from granting interim or interlocutory injunctions in such matters. If those two provisions are valid and directly applicable to the Gombe versus Mark dispute, then the Federal High Court and the Court of Appeal had no jurisdiction to hear the case in the first place. If they had no jurisdiction, the Court of Appeal's preservatory order, which is the entire legal basis for INEC's April 1 derecognition, is void. And if that order is void, INEC's action has no legal foundation at all. This is the argument that the ADC's lawyers are developing in their Federal High Court challenge. The ADC Youth Wing statement said it directly. INEC has no constitutional authority to interpret court orders. That duty belongs strictly to the courts. What INEC has done is not neutrality. It is, in their words, complicity, partisanship, and institutional sabotage. Constitutional framework. Section 225, 1999 Constitution as amended. INEC's authority to maintain register of political parties. Electoral Act 2026, Section 83, subsection 5. No court shall entertain jurisdiction over internal party affairs. Electoral Act 2026, subsection 6, prohibits courts from granting interim or interlocutory injunctions in such matters. Court of Appeal ruling, suit number CA/ABJ/145/2026, Senator David Mark versus Honorable Nafiu Bala Gombe, delivered March 12, 2026. Federal High Court case FHC/ABJ/1819/2025, filed September 2, 2025. INEC announcement, April 1, 2026, signed by National Commissioner Mohammed Kudu Haruna. The ambiguity INEC has exploited before. What makes INEC's position institutionally powerful and institutionally dangerous is a gap in Nigerian electoral law that has survived every amendment since 1999. The Electoral Act empowers INEC to recognize party leadership, but does not specify the evidentiary standard INEC must apply when two factions produce competing documentation. INEC's internal guidelines fill this gap, but those guidelines are not statute. They are administratively derived, interpretively flexible, and, as the ADC is now arguing, potentially at odds with the Section 83 provisions that limit court involvement in party internal affairs. This is not a new dynamic. In the period leading to the 2015 elections, multiple party formations navigated exactly these kinds of internal Congress disputes. The APC's own 2013 merger navigated INEC administrative challenges, competing Congress claims, and documentation disputes that are structurally identical to what the ADC now faces. The ADC coalition, by contrast, seems to have prioritized the speed of political assembly over the rigor of legal architecture. That sequencing error is now being exploited. Here is the institutional fact that reframes this entire dispute. The party that built the playbook that is now being used against the ADC is the APC. The APC's own founders, several of whom today serve in Tinubu's government, navigated identical INEC administrative challenges in 2013 by ensuring that every Congress was documented, every executive list was notarized, and every legal challenge was anticipated and countered before it could land Achilles' heel. The ADC coalition walked into a known legal trap
because it moved fast and assumed that political momentum would substitute for legal architecture. It did not, and the institution now exploiting that sequencing error is the same INEC that the APC used to validate its own merger 13 years ago.
Why the ADC issued this ultimatum? The 72-hour ultimatum is not primarily a legal strategy. It is a political communication strategy. An ultimatum with a specific deadline and a specific consequence creates media coverage, generates a news cycle, and forces INEC into a visible position. If INEC complies, the ADC wins a public victory and demonstrates institutional responsiveness to opposition pressure. If INEC does not comply, and the ADC follows through on the occupation threat, the confrontation between an opposition coalition and the Electoral Commission becomes a national story that the APC cannot easily manage without appearing to endorse institutional suppression of democratic competition. The ADC youth leaders' explicit appeal to the military to remain neutral is also a political calculation. By naming the military as an actor that should stay away from this dispute, the ADC is simultaneously putting the military on the public record as a relevant stakeholder and signaling to Nigerian political observers that the opposition believes the stakes of this confrontation are high enough that institutional actors beyond INEC may be drawn in. That is not an accidental framing. Who benefits from the ADC's administrative paralysis? The primary beneficiary of the ADC's administrative paralysis is the APC, and specifically the 2027 re-election architecture of President Tinubu. The ADC coalition, had it completed its assembly without disruption, represented the most coherent opposition formation since 2015. Atiku's northern PDP infrastructure, Obi's urban youth mobilization capacity, Kwankwaso's Kano base, Amaechi's south-south connections, Aregbersola's southwest credibility. On paper, this coalition could clear the constitutional threshold of 25% in at least 24 of 36 states. Individually, none of them can. The INEC action, whether or not it was directed from outside the commission, produces the exact outcome that the APC's 2027 political machine requires: a fragmented opposition platform in which Atiku, Obi, and Kwankwaso are each forced to make individual decisions about their 2027 vehicles rather than moving as a unified coalition. Every week the ADC spends in litigation is a week the APC campaigns uncontested. David Mark's Defiance, strategy or gamble? David Mark held his own press conference on April 2, vowing that the ADC would proceed with its congresses as scheduled. The timetable he published runs from April 7 through April 14th, screening ward congresses, state congresses, and a national convention, all without INEC supervision because INEC has frozen engagement with both factions. This is a high-risk legal strategy. INEC Chairman Amupitan publicly invoked the Zamfara precedent on April 3, the documented case where courts voided election results produced through unsupervised primaries that violated court orders. If the ADC conducts its convention on April 14th without judicial clearance, and the Federal High Court subsequently rules against the Mark faction, any presidential candidate produced through that convention is legally vulnerable to disqualification. Mark is betting that the Federal High Court will move fast enough to vindicate him. That bet has a specific outcome. If the court rules quickly in his favor, the ADC emerges from this crisis with a stronger legal foundation and a convention on the record. If it does not, the ADC enters the 2027 primary season with a disputed primary result layered on top of an unresolved leadership question. Here is the political fact that Tinubu's team understands and the ADC has not yet fully processed. The Zamfara precedent from the INEC Chairman is not just a legal caution, it is a political signal. If the ADC holds its April 14th convention without INEC supervision and the Federal High Court later voids it, the ADC enters the 2027 election without a verified primary result, without INEC oversight of its nomination process, and with a legal challenge attached to whoever it produces as a presidential candidate. In that scenario, the APC does not need to defeat the ADC at the ballot. It defeats the ADC in court before the campaign formally opens. The Zamfara precedent is not a neutral legal warning. It is a roadmap for how to eliminate a presidential candidacy through procedural challenge rather than electoral competition. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything.
What this does to Nigerian democratic institutions. A democracy's health is not measured by whether elections are held. It is measured by whether the institutions administering those elections are trusted by all significant political actors to operate with neutrality and consistency. What the ADC crisis has produced, whatever the legal merits of each side's argument, is a situation in which Nigeria's primary opposition coalition formally accuses its electoral commission of complicity, partisanship, and institutional sabotage, and then issues a deadline for the commission's compliance or threatens to physically occupy its offices. That is not a normal feature of a functioning democratic system. It is a symptom of institutional breakdown. When an opposition party feels it must threaten to occupy INEC offices to get the commission to follow a court order, the implicit message is that normal institutional channels have been exhausted or are perceived as compromised. That perception, whether or not it reflects objective reality, is itself a democratic crisis. A 2027 election administered by a commission that the primary opposition coalition has publicly accused of partisan conduct, demanded the resignation of its chairman over, and threatened to physically occupy, is not an election whose results will be accepted as legitimate by any side that loses it. The federal state power dimension. There is a dimension to the ADC crisis that Nigerian political commentary consistently under-analyzes: the effect on opposition state governors. The governors of states where the ADC coalition has political presence and where opposition to the federal government translates into annual FAAC allocation negotiations, security deployment requests, and federal infrastructure siting decisions, lose bargaining leverage when the national opposition platform is paralyzed. A credible opposition presidential candidacy gives opposition governors a national platform from which to extract federal commitments. A fragmented opposition removes that platform and pushes each opposition governor into individual accommodation with the federal center. The ADC crisis is not just about who leads a political party. It is about the federal state power balance in the 12 months before the election. What Nigeria's international partners are watching. Nigeria's international partners, the United States, United Kingdom, European Union, and ECOWAS, have all identified Nigerian democratic stability as a strategic interest ahead of 2027. None of them will issue formal statements about the ADC-INEC dispute, but they watch it. A 2027 election cycle in which the primary opposition coalition was administratively disrupted 9 months before polling day and in which the opposition publicly threatened to occupy the Electoral Commission's offices will inform how those partners calibrate their engagement with whoever wins on debt restructuring, trade preferences, security cooperation frameworks, and IMF program conditionality. Democratic credibility has economic consequences in Nigeria's specific position as Africa's largest economy and the anchor of West African stability. The most underreported consequence of the ADC crisis is what it signals to the 65 million Nigerians who did not vote in 2023. The 2023 election had a turnout below 30%, the lowest in the Fourth Republic. The 65 million non-voters are the real 2027 battleground, when those citizens who already concluded in 2023 that the electoral system did not deserve their participation watch the primary opposition coalition being administratively paralyzed by the Electoral Commission 9 months before polling day. The message they receive is not that the system has a problem that can be fixed by voting. The message they receive is that the system is designed to produce a predetermined outcome regardless of their participation. Every week of ADC-INEC crisis is a week of voter demobilization
among the very population that a competitive 2027 election requires to show up.
Most likely next moves by each actor. The ADC will pursue two tracks simultaneously. In court, an emergency federal high court application challenging the jurisdiction of the Court of Appeal under Section 83(5) and 83(6) of the Electoral Act 2026. If that application succeeds, the entire legal basis for INEC's derecognition collapses. On the street, the 72-hour ultimatum is a negotiating position, not a guaranteed action. The occupation threat is leverage. Its value is in the credibility of the threat, not necessarily in its execution. Watch whether the April 14 convention actually happens, and if it does, who is present. INEC will not reverse its position publicly within 72 hours. To do so would be to acknowledge that it acted incorrectly and to invite every future opposition party to use ultimatums as a tool for compelling administrative reversals. INEC's stated position that it is complying with a Court of Appeal order is legally defensible and institutionally necessary for the Commission to maintain. What INEC can do, and what may happen quietly, is expedite the Federal High Court hearing through its own legal team's cooperation with an accelerated scheduling request. The Court of Appeal itself ordered accelerated hearing of the substantive case. Whether that order is being acted upon is the signal to watch most closely. The APC will remain publicly silent and privately satisfied. Every week the ADC spends managing this crisis is a week the APC builds 2027 infrastructure uncontested. Festus Keyam's public statement that the ADC should thank INEC for its derecognition and the APC National Publicity Secretary's call for INEC to deregister the ADC entirely reveal the APC's preferred outcome, not resolution but disintegration. Obi will maintain strategic ambiguity. Labour Party's April 28th presidential primary is on the record. Obi has not declared for it or against it. His silence is a signal that he is watching the ADC's Federal High Court challenge before committing to Labour as his 2027 vehicle. If the court vindicates the ADC, he stays in the coalition. If it does not, Labour is his insurance policy and the 2027 opposition fragments into the exact multi-candidate scenario that Tinubu survived in 2023. 3 signals to watch in the next 30 days. Signal 1. Whether the Federal High Court grants the ADC's jurisdictional challenge under Section 83. A ruling that the court proceedings were void from the start reverses the entire crisis. A ruling against the ADC locks in the status quo and forces every coalition member to make an individual platform decision. Signal 2. Whether the April 14 ADC National Convention is held with senior coalition figures present. If Atiku, Obi, Kwankwaso and Amaechi appear at a convention held without INEC supervision, the coalition is signaling that it will contest the legal consequences and live with the Zamfara risk. If senior figures stay away, the coalition is fracturing. Signal 3. Whether Peter Obi declares for the Labour Party presidential primary scheduled for April 28th. An Obi declaration for Labour ends the unified opposition coalition's 2027 architecture, regardless of what happens in the ADC's court battle. That single decision is the most consequential variable in the 2027 opposition landscape that is currently unresolved. The timing question, why INEC waited from March 12 to March 31st to act on the Court of Appeal ruling, and why the announcement came 48 hours after Kwankwaso's March 30th defection to the ADC, cannot be definitively resolved by this analysis. What can be stated is that the documented sequence is on the public record, that the political effect of the timing is precisely what the APC required, and that INEC has not provided a public explanation for the 19-day gap between the court ruling and its administrative action. In the absence of that explanation, the ADC's characterization of the timing as politically motivated will remain the dominant narrative in opposition circles and will define how any 2027 INEC-related dispute
is read by opposition supporters regardless of its actual legal merits. The ADC's decision to proceed with congresses on a schedule that defies INEC's freeze is either the most courageous act of democratic self-determination by a Nigerian opposition party in recent memory, or the most consequential legal miscalculation. The answer depends entirely on what the Federal High Court does. If the court moves quickly and rules in the ADC's favor on the Section 83 jurisdictional argument, David Mark's defiance will be validated and the coalition will emerge legally hardened. If the court does not move quickly or rules against the ADC, the Zamfara precedent becomes the weapon that ends the coalition's 2027 presidential candidacy before it begins. The coalition's fate is in the court, not in the streets, not in the ultimatum, in the Federal High Court.
Best and worst case for Nigerian democracy. Best case. The Federal High Court rules quickly on the Section 83 jurisdictional challenge, finds that the court proceedings against the ADC were void from the start, restores the Mark-led ADC leadership administratively, and the coalition uses the disruption as a forcing function to finally resolve the ticket question, producing a unified North-South presidential structure before the end of 2026. The 2027 election is genuinely competitive. INEC administers a process that all major actors accept as sufficiently credible to make the result legitimate. Whoever wins governs a country where the institutional crises were resolved rather than suppressed. Worst case. The court process extends past the April 14 convention. The ADC holds an unsupervised convention that produces a disputed result. Obi declares for Labour, Atiku contests on a legally challenged ADC platform, and the opposition enters 2027 fragmented across 3 platforms. Tinubu wins a second term with a plurality in a divided field. His second mandate begins with the opposition formally contesting the legitimacy of the electoral process, the ADC's presidential candidates subject to disqualification proceedings, and 65 million non-voters having received the clearest possible signal that participation does not change outcomes. That is not a second term. That is the beginning of a governance crisis that no election can resolve. We opened with a question. What does it mean when a political party threatens to occupy the offices of its country's electoral commission? Here is what the evidence shows. The ADC coalition assembled the most significant opposition formation since 2015. 2 days after that assembly was completed by Kwankwaso's defection, INEC acted on a court ruling that had been available to it for 19 days. The ADC responded by issuing a 72-hour ultimatum and threatening to occupy every INEC office in the country. INEC brushed off the demand. David Mark vowed to proceed with congresses regardless. Peter Obi has stayed conspicuously silent. The legal question, whether INEC was right to act and whether the courts had jurisdiction to issue the order it acted on, is before the Federal High Court. That court's ruling will determine the operational reality of the 2027 election more directly than anything any politician says in the next 30 days. But the political question is already answered by the fact that the question exists at all. A democracy in which the primary opposition coalition is threatening to occupy the Electoral Commission's offices 9 months before a general election is not a democracy consolidating. It is a democracy stress testing, and the result of that test will not be known until the Federal High Court speaks. Watch the court, watch the April 14 convention, watch what Peter Obi does before April 28th. Those 3 signals will tell you before any analyst does whether 2027 is genuinely competitive or whether it has already been decided in a room nobody voted for. You now know something that most Nigerians watching the news tonight do not know. What you do with it is up to you. Share it, debate it, challenge it. That is how democracies survive. Afro News HQ, Nigeria deserves better analysis. See you in the next one.